everybody, welcome back to my channel. My name is Zara and today I am going to be reacting to your unpopular opinions today. So I posted a post on my community tab a few weeks ago about your unpopular opinions and I said I was going to react to them. So I have them up here on my laptop. So if you see me looking down, that's what I'm looking at. And I'm just going to go through each one. There's about 25, I think. And yeah, let's just jump in. This is going to get spicy, I have a feeling. All right, let's start. First up, we have Black and Blue Collar Reader. Hey Dan, how's it going? He says, writers such as Baker, Jimenez and Meeville deserve more admiration in the fantasy community. Oh, and romantasy should be placed in a category with cringe words such as undulate and moist. We definitely agree on the second one. I actually wrote on my Twitter a few weeks ago, I hate the word romantasy because it's so cringe. Like, people, please, like, do we have to shorten everything? Just call it romantic fantasy or fantasy romance. Like, it's really not that hard. And yeah, I definitely think it's up there with undulate and moist. Undulate just makes me cringe. Like my body is physically cringing right now. As for the first part, writers such as Baker, Jimenez and Meeville deserve much more admiration in the fantasy community. I agree with you. I haven't read Jimenez yet. Meeville, I've read one of his shorter stories and I really liked it. Like, I really enjoyed his writing style. It was very different to what I have read typically in fantasy. Baker, 100%. I don't think Baker gets talked about enough in the fantasy community, but hopefully that's going to start changing because I feel like more and more people are picking up the series, which is fantastic. Jimenez, I don't know because I haven't read Jimenez yet, but I have got a few of his books, so I'll be able to comment on that in the coming months. Next we have Jim. Warhammer books include some excellent entries, as powerful and well written as some of the most highly regarded works in the genre. You know, I've actually heard this before. I've not read any Warhammer books yet, apart from like a collection of short stories that I really enjoyed at the time that I read it, because it's really grimdark. And I know Warhammer is like some of the original grimdark, so that's really cool to kind of see the root of where like that word has come from. And it doesn't surprise me, honestly, that some of Warhammer is kind of up there with the pinnacle of fantasy that we have today. Again, I can't really comment directly because I haven't read any kind of full-length novels, though I do own quite a few now. It's just a matter of when I get to them. But I've heard good things from a decent amount of people whose opinions that I fairly trust. Next, we have a comment from Hyperion404. I don't know if this is a hot take, but I think most people don't do anywhere near enough research in the genres and books they read and end up reading more subpar fiction than they have to. I do agree with this. I think a lot of people will like see lists or like view stories on TikTok or Instagram where it's like 5 books to read if you like. That's not really doing research. A lot of that is actually quite passive and quite reactive. And often those lists tend to be really bad, in my opinion, because they all end up shoving the same books in your face, and popularity doesn't equals good quality writing, as I've said before on my channel. But yeah, I do agree. I one of the things that I try to do a lot of is research. Like, I try to find hidden gems, books that are less talked about, and try to do reviews on those books and maybe give a bit of attention to them, especially if I really love them. But yeah, I definitely do agree with that. I do think people should do more research about the types of things that they like reading to kind of find their next favourite, for sure. All right, next we have Derek. The hottest take I have is that I have nothing nice to say about Ready Player One, and it's one of the only books I've ever DNF'd. I'm very happy so many people have gotten joy out of reading it, and I think there may have been the bones of a good story in there somewhere, but to me it had nothing going for it in terms of plot or the characters. It borders on straight up copyright infringement for numerous IPs, and it commits all the writing things that they teach you not to do in an intro to creative writing course. I get that a lot of the pull is nostalgia and nerd culture stuff, but I frankly had more interesting geek conversations with my friends. Interesting. I've never read Ready Player One, and the reason why I haven't is because there's a few people whose opinions I do trust, and they all told me not to read it. So Derek, your opinion is definitely shared with at least a small group of people that I know. I have heard a lot of other people say that it's amazing and it's like classic sci-fi that you have to read. But I've read a lot of horror stories about that book and have zero interest in reading it. So I agree with you. I do agree with you. Next up, we have Josh. The stereotype that fantasy fiction consists of poor writing is largely true. Popular authors such as John Gwynne, Adrian Tchaikovsky, and James Islington are good storytellers but bad writers. When you come across a fantasy author that can write very well, such as Lois McMaster Bujold, Laini Taylor, or Joe Abercrombie, it is a breath of fresh air. I agree with this. I wholeheartedly agree with this, Josh. A lot of these aren't unpopular to me, guys. I'm agreeing with pretty much everything that's been said to me, which is so funny. But no, I do agree. Yeah, I completely agree. And I 100% I agree with the examples that Josh gave in his list. I think John Gwynne, I think The Faithful and the Fallen was a series that I really loved at the time that I was reading it, and I think it had some really good aspects, but in hindsight I think that is a very hyped series, and I don't think the writing is that good. To Josh's point, I think the storytelling is good, and I think there's certain mechanisms that Gwynne uses that makes the story compelling, but that doesn't necessarily make you a good writer. Tchaikovsky, I've talked about before. I've tried to read like 3 or 4 of his books now, and I've totally fallen flat on every single one, and it's just because his writing style is just so inaccessible, and it's so hard to read. It's just very dense, but like not in a good way. And I would also even argue that somebody like Mark Lawrence fits into that category. I did love one of his series, but then I read his most recent release and I just found it so difficult to read. And again, not because the book is bad, but I think the way he writes the book is bad, and it doesn't get across what he actually really wants to get across to the reader. I'm definitely in the minority in that though, because I think a lot of people love that book and love his writing in general. And I've definitely had successes with some of his other stuff, like Prince of Thorns I quite enjoyed. But at the same time, I do think they're kind of almost 2 different mindsets, and not necessarily every single author employs both those mindsets when they're writing. I do agree with Josh as well that Bujold and Abercrombie are fantastic examples of this. Laini Taylor I haven't read yet, but I do have some of her books, so maybe this will push me to read some of her books sooner rather than later. A few people agreed with Josh as well, so Josh, you're onto something there. Plated Lizard said Stephen Bruce is shamefully underrated. I can't speak to that because I've not read Stephen Bruce, but I did buy like 3 of his books recently, so I will be able to make a comment on that soon. A lot of his plots sound fascinating, so I'm hoping that I'm going to agree with you, Plated Lizard. Then we have Jen13728. People often say Joe Abercrombie is a great character writer, and though he's got some good ones like Doctor and Logan, most of his characters after the first trilogy start to sound the same. Oh, you're hurting me, Jen. Have the same voice or character traits to the point I can't even distinguish them properly or even remember their names. Actually, to be honest, personally could not stand Glockter lol. He was annoying to read about, but I mentioned him because he's one of the very few ones that are at least memorable. Okay, where do we start? I agree with you. He does have some good ones. I think I've said this before, Logan is one of my favourite characters of all time. I do think he does employ the same types of characters. Like, I don't disagree with that. I do disagree with the fact that they often feel the same, because I feel like a lot of his characters feel quite distinct. But I think it's a fair comment. I think if it's like an average series for a reader, I can see you not being able to distinguish between characters. I think if you're somebody who really loves the story and the characters, then it's going to be a lot easier for you to pick up on things that maybe distinguish characters, if that makes sense. But yeah, I mean, while it hurt me, this comment, I can also understand where you're coming from. Y'all Trippin 2073. How's it going, y'all? He said, Books with Zara is the only reliable booktuber. No comment. I can't comment on comments about myself. I feel like that's a bit weird. But if he says it's true, there we go. At Keller3647, if you're going to read tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow, borrow it from the library. Don't waste your money. Too late. I already did buy it on ebook. I'm really curious now because this book has got so much love for it, and I haven't heard like one bad review apart from this one comment. So again, I haven't read it, so I can't comment on it, but I'll hopefully be able to report on that in the coming months. All right, next up we got V3 Millionaire. How's it going, V3 Millionaire? Brandon Sanderson is a contender for best author of all time, irrespective of genre. With that said, however, he doesn't even make the top 10 list if we consider him as a writer. That last statement still holds true even if we narrow it down to just fantasy genre, and it still holds true even if we narrow it down further to just epic fantasy genre. As a professional author, he's one of the best in the business, but as a writer, he is great, but not good enough, in my opinion, to contend for greatest. To clarify, when I use the term author, I am taking into consideration everything that he does in regards to his profession, such as marketing, fan interaction, general professionalism, how he's regarded by his peers in the business, etc. When I use the term writer, I'm speaking exclusively about his writing and nothing else. So just to reiterate, Sanderson is, in my opinion, GOAT author, and although he is a great writer, in my opinion, he's not great enough to be the GOAT writer. I actually agree with a lot of this. I think Sanderson is a really smart businessman, and I think he knows how to use his popularity and his fan base to his advantage, and I think it's really smart. I think he also has a really good team around him. I think he's got a really good support system around him, and I think when you have all those things in place, it allows you to focus on things that maybe a lot of authors can't focus on, or a lot of writers can't focus on. You know, he does this full time. He has the freedom to be able to write his books in the way that he wants to write them. Again, a lot of writers don't necessarily have that luxury. So yes, I think he's a very smart businessman. I think he has an amazing team, and I think he's really marketed himself as somebody to admire as well. Like, I definitely do admire Brandon Sanderson, even though I think a lot of his books are just bad. Which is where I disagree with you, where on the writer part, because I don't even think he's a great writer. I think he's a very average writer. I think he's probably one of the most average writers I've ever read. I think his books are too wordy, too long. His characters are very one-dimensional. Most of them are very one-dimensional. I think his plots are not particularly original. I don't think they're executed that well. I just think everything's meh, to be honest. Yeah. And there are some books of his that I really liked. Wallbreaker is one, as an example. I did really like The Emperor's Soul. Mistborn was fun at the time that I read it. But I wouldn't say they are books that I actively think about and actively wish to reread. And I don't think his writing, when I think of my top authors in terms of writing capability, Sanderson is nowhere near that list. He's just not even on the list, never mind near the top of the list. So, yeah. I half agree with you, basically. All right, we've got Stephen Pramell. The more prolific the author is on social media, the shitter the book is likely to be. I don't know if I entirely agree with this, Stephen. I think we agree on a lot of things. I don't know if I entirely agree with this statement, though, because I follow some really active authors on Twitter, and they've written good books. I've also followed some really quiet authors on Twitter to the point where I've just unfollowed them because I don't get anything from them. And their books aren't great. So I don't know. I think there is this whole thing around, like, if your book isn't that good and if you don't have confidence in your book, maybe you're like overcompensating or something. But I can't think of an example that comes to mind right now. And I'm pretty active on book Twitter, but I could be wrong. I'm sure there's definitely edge cases. I'm curious if there's any names that come to mind for you, but I totally understand if you don't want to tell me. All right. Next up, we have I Am DMMN. Jade City was extremely underwhelming and had very typical characters that were not interesting at all. Oh, my friend. We're going to be best friends. You're right. I agree. It was extremely underwhelming to the point where I question almost all of Booktube. And it did have very typical characters that had no depth and was super flat. Totally agree with you. This is definitely an unpopular opinion, but I 100% agree with you. Couldn't have put it better myself. Next up, we have Chloe Frizzle. Many series are better read out of order. Chloe, you gotta explain more. You gotta give me an example where that has worked for you, because as somebody who likes structure and I like order, that sounds absolutely horrific to me, to like willingly choose to read a series out of order. I could see it working for certain series where, you know, maybe each book is fairly confined story-wise. But, you know, as an example, I would never imagine reading Mistborn Era 1 out of order. Like, it just wouldn't make sense. So I'm curious what series you've read out of order and kind of how that worked for you, because that to me hurts my soul a little bit. I'm not going to lie. Next up, we have Eric McLuhan, 5177. People forgive Fitz as a whiny teenage mass murderer because he likes puppies. Okay, I haven't read Robin Hobb yet, so I'm definitely intrigued. I wish Tad Williams would have gotten to his horrible ending in Memory, Sorrow and Thorn about 1,000 pages sooner. Also have that series on my list, so maybe I should delay that one for a very, very long time. Same for Otherland, but only about 500 pages. I haven't read any of these series, so I can't comment, but I know a lot of the very classic old school fantasy authors, especially, you know, the books went on for days and they really didn't need to. So honestly, it doesn't surprise me at all. Next up, we have Lee Hunt's. A lot of literary fiction is an idiot's understanding of profound. People think that prose that is hard to read must be smart, when it's often just written in a needlessly convoluted way. An obsession with inserted clauses and rambling sentences not clever. American Pastoral is a good example. I haven't read American Pastoral, but I 100% agree with this. I have said before that simple writing is often the most effective way to tell a story. We don't need all the bells and whistles all the time, if at all, to be honest. And I do find it very hard sometimes reading literary fiction, because you can tell that the author is just trying too hard. You can tell they're trying to sound smart. You can tell they're trying really hard to like sound like they're really intellectual. And it's like, mate, you don't need to do that. Just say what you need to say, get it done, and then we could all move on with our lives. So I agree with you, Lee. We got Stephen again. Books that are based on the D&D campaign the author plays with their friends are always dog shit. This is probably true. I definitely stay away from like D&D inspired fantasy because, one, I've never played D&D, though I would really like to, and I have friends of mine who've been trying to convince me to join their D&D campaigns, and I will one day. I don't know, like I just don't know if that would necessarily translate well to a fictional fantasy story, even though it's just another way of telling a story, if that makes sense. But yeah, I'm not surprised somebody said this, to be honest. Yeah. All right, we have Esme. I hated Dune and I think the movie was much better. I disagree. I disagree. I think the movie was okay. It was way too long and they needed to reduce that down by probably about half the time. Like, it was a beautifully shot film and the soundtrack was amazing. The costumes were amazing, but I think the narrative choice to extend it out was smart because they're probably going to make a trilogy off of it. So fair enough. But at the same time, it wasn't needed for that book. And I just think it was too much. But I think the book was okay as well. Like, I've talked about this before. I think the first book was all right. For me, Messiah is so much better than the first book. But I do think the book is still better than the movie, in my opinion. Jen B9742. I don't like Brandon Sanderson. Same. It's not that I don't like him as a person. I just don't like his writing. I just think it's so overrated. So we agree. Next up, we've got Tovex76. First Law after the original trilogy is boring and repetitive. You guys are killing me with the First Law ones. Stephen Pacey is also overrated and half of his voices all sound the same. Booktubers say they want discussion, but what they mean is engagement with their content. Almost every channel regularly says how they are not in this for the views and just in it for community and book discussions. Yet those same people then say they only post spoiler-free reviews and basic ask content because that's the only thing people watch, and all of their replies to comments are some generic thanks for watching. If booktubers truly want discussion, then they should be posting spoiler content and getting into theories, questions, explanations, deep dives with other fans of the books in the comments. Okay, I'm going to start off with First Law. So I disagree, obviously, and I think a lot of people would disagree, but I've always said this. I don't think First Law is for everybody, and I think a certain type of person is going to really love it, and I think a certain type of person is going to really hate it and find it boring and repetitive. So I think that's fine. I've not listened to the audiobooks by Stephen Pacey, but I'm sure a lot of Stephen Pacey fans are going to disagree with that comment. I think on the Booktube stuff, this is interesting. So I'm going to go through this again if you see me looking down. Almost every channel regularly says how they are not in this for the views and just in it for community and book discussions. Yeah, those same people say they only post spoiler-free reviews and basic ask content because that's the only thing that people watch. I don't know if I agree with that. I think for a lot of people, I mean, obviously you want your channel to grow to some extent. Like, you wouldn't just want your channel to be like static, right? So yeah, to some extent you are going to be optimizing for engagement. I mean, that's something that I think about a lot. I do not see Booktube as like this money making thing. You're going into Booktube for the wrong reasons if you think you're going to make money out of it. Like, it's just not going to happen unless you're one of the like really, really, really big ones. Yeah, I mean, I think it's good to diversify content for sure. I think on the spoiler free ones, I think, yeah, I mean, you want to get your comments out to the most people as possible, because you also want more people to click on the video. A lot of people don't want to watch spoiler filled reviews, right? And they want to watch non-spoiler reviews. So I think that makes sense. I think it's important to have a mixture of the two though. Like, I try to do some spoiler ones when I can and when I feel like it makes sense to. But yeah, I think definitely more can be done. Yeah, the responding to comments as some generic thanks for watching, I agree with you. I think it's important to be more active in response to your subscribers, because I think, again, it goes back to the community aspect. If you're doing it for community, then you should be talking to your subscribers. I almost dropped my laptop. So I do agree with that one, for sure. And then if booktubers truly want discussion, then they should be posting spoiler content, getting into theories, questions, explanations, deep dives with other fans of the books in comments. Yeah, the spoiler content I don't entirely agree with. I think it depends, and I think a mixture of the two is good. And yeah, getting into theories, questions, explanations, deep dives with other... Yeah, I agree. I think it's good to diversify content. So I think we're pretty aligned. Okay, we've only got a few more left. Lee is up again. Fiction is often a garbage way to communicate moral themes. Moral principles are often preferred because of certain limitations put upon us by the fickle nature of reality. Fiction allows us to create conveniences and further support ill-conceived moral principles because things just happen to go right. Either that, or you're encouraged to judge people in certain ways that are ultimately not fair in the real world. I think Bachman's Beartown is an example that would be quite controversial. Innocence until proven guilty is important because of uncertainty. Bring that certainty to the reader and you've missed the point. That's really interesting. And you know what? I need to think on this comment more. But I think I agree with that. I do actually think I agree with that. I think it's important to note that I think a lot of fiction is trying to make a statement, and not all fiction is equal in achieving that goal. I think the whole idea about fiction being a garbage way to communicate moral themes, I don't know if I necessarily agree with that. I think the way that it's often done is a garbage way to communicate it, but I think fiction is actually a really good way to communicate moral themes, because I think that's one of the ways that we learn, right? I think that's one of the ways that we open up our curiosity and our intellect to different things that we don't necessarily have direct experience in. And I think fiction books particularly are just one way of being able to do that. So while I agree with the kind of philosophy of the statement, and especially the kind of second half of it, I don't know if I necessarily agree with that first sentence, but I'm going to think on this one a bit more because that's super interesting. All right, next up we have Mika Hall. Brandon Sanderson is a horrible writer in many aspects. Terrible prose, cringe dialogue and humour, and honestly pretty juvenile. Yeah, I agree with you. Totally agree. Again, I think we're in the minority, but 100% Micah. Totally agree. And then last but not least, we have Steve Talks Books. The First Law trilogy is overrated and standalones the second trilogy are just bad. Yeah, I disagree. I mean, maybe the series is overrated, but it's a series that I love so much that I can accept that I can no longer be objective about it. I think the standalones, especially Heroes, is amazing. I think it's written so well. And I think Red Country is also a really interesting take on the Western genre. I think the second trilogy is definitely his weakest work, but I wouldn't say it's bad. So yeah, there we have it. That was really fun. And there were some really interesting comments here. And I just want to say thank you to everybody who posted a comment. Really appreciate it. And I'll probably do another one of these again in the coming months. But it was fun. I really enjoyed it. And funnily enough, I actually agreed with most of you on your comments. So I don't know what that says about us. There we go. Hope you all have a lovely day. Stay safe as always. Take care and I'll see you soon. Bye.